Welcome, everyone. I'm Eileen Silverglide, Chief Revenue Officer of Leaders Group Sports, a family of brands comprised of Sports Business Journal, Sport Techie, and Leaders in Sport. So glad that y'all are able to join us today for what is going to be an awesome 45-50 minutes, where we're going to talk about how the pandemic forced a revamp of mental health and inclusion in youth sports. So welcome to Evening the Playing Field. I'm joined today by an awesome panel of experts. Can't wait to introduce you. But before I do it, let's go ahead and just talk about a couple of logistics. Number one, we'd love your questions and comments. The line is being moderated, so if there's something a question you want me to pose to one of our panel of experts, just chat me, it'll be fed right to me, and I'll go ahead and pose the question. After the webinar, we're going to be distributing an awesome zip file of some documents that this team has provided. There's a tremendous amount of data that we're going to be sharing with you, as well as some solutions for what we as a society can do, and honestly, even as parents can do, to really make sure that we are thinking about evening the playing field. So with that, let me go ahead and introduce my panel, and then I'll share with you a quick agenda of where we're headed today. Lance Lee, Director of Community Impact at TeamSnap. Martin Fox, and I will call him Martin, not Marty, to make sure we are crystal clear in this webinar, who we're addressing the questions to, is the lead for Project Play 2024 with the Aspen Institute. And here's Marty Reed, who is a former D1 athlete, Director of National Partnerships, Manager of DEI Programming at the Positive Coaching Alliance. So where are we headed? First off, what we're going to do is make sure that we're really establishing the groundwork for where we are in terms of this issue. So we're going to talk through some data. We're going to be sharing some terms and some definitions and make sure we're really understanding what has happened since the pandemic to youth sports and what has the impact been. It's incredibly important that we leave you all as an audience with some solutions. These are frankly some scary problems, and there's a lot to talk about. So we want to make sure that today we have some short-term solutions we talk through, some long-term solutions, and that all of you on the line can think about how you can make an impact and further change. So with that, let's go ahead and dive in. As I mentioned, we're going to talk about how we can really lay the groundwork first. Marty, I'm going to go ahead and start with you, please. There's a lot of terms that we're going to talk about today. We're talking about mental illness, mental wellness. We're talking about inclusion. We're talking about access, all in regard to youth sports. In your work, could you please help us really think through how do you think about these terms and really how do you define them so we can make sure we're on a level playing field here?
Thank you, Eileen. That's a great question because it's important to define these terms and understand that mental health and mental illness, it can help eliminate the stigma and other barriers that keep people from seeking help when they need it when we define these terms. So I'm not a doctor, but according to the CDC, mental illness refers to conditions that affect a person's thinking, feeling, mood, or behavior. A mental illness is diagnosable, right? A diagnosable disorder, even though not all are diagnosed, but it has a standard set of criteria, and it can be caused, by different factors like genetics, brain chemistry, or trauma. And we know common examples like anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, etc. While mental health reflects our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. So this also affects how we think, feel, and act, and has a strong impact on the way we socialize and interact with others, and how we show up in spaces, how we handle problems and challenges, how we handle stress, and how we relate to others and make healthy decisions. So I think in essence, the two are not the same. While we all have mental health, and mental health affects all people, some people might experience mental illness. And I think it's important to acknowledge that mental illness doesn't always lead to poor mental health, or that poor mental health is not always due to mental illness.
Mm-hmm. And then, of course, you have the component of adding physical health into this.
Absolutely.
And certainly the linkage between, how your mental health is doing and what, of course, that means to you physically.
Yes, yes. And I think it's important to understand that while we dive deeper into today's conversation, but things like discrimination and exclusion have a large impact on a person's mental health and their mental well-being.
Yep, yep. We're definitely going to talk a lot more about that. A little bit to that point, Martin, I know the work that you have done at the Aspen Institute in conjunction with TeamSnap and otherwise, as I was doing the research, was so profound. And I was wondering if you could share some of the highlights of the survey that you did from the student perspective. And then I'll probably ask you as well about the study that you did from the parent perspective. So I think that was so interesting. So just help us understand here, where are we post-pandemic with students today?
Yeah, absolutely. In a survey that you mentioned of high schoolers that we commissioned as part of our Reimagining School Sports project during the 2020-2021 school year, 81% of high school athletes said that they played sports to have fun. It was the most popular response. They also said that they played to develop skills and to make friends. Almost half explicitly identified that they play for their emotional well-being and mental health, including 56% of girls identified that their mental health was one of the key reasons they participated in sports. Winning competition was only the most popular response, right? So it certainly seems, talking to the students themselves at the high school level, you really can see the value to the athlete of sports participation on mental health.
And obviously that was surprising, right? I mean, I was able to do some of the research and reading. I don't think I would have guessed in a million years that success on the field, in the court, would be that far down.
It's interesting that actually backs up data that we've seen for a number of years. There was a landmark study done by the George Washington University School of Public Health a number of years back, where winning was the top factor among 81 listed factors for athletes. So that's actually been relatively consistent. I'm sorry, winning was not the top factor. Fun was the top factor for youth athletes. So it's actually been pretty consistent. The evidence base showing that the primary driver of youth sports participation for kids is having fun. Now, if that's the primary driver for their parents, it's a separate question.
Well, which of course is where we're going. So I did find it fascinating that you all did the research from the student perspective as well as the parent perspective. I'm sure many people on the line today are parents as well as folks in the sports business industry. So let's talk about it. So you ran a very similar survey in terms of parents and their expectations of youth sports and what it was going to do for their children. Can you share some of those insights?
Sure. We ran a survey a number of times throughout the pandemic, most recently last September, for parents of younger athletes, ages 6 to 12. And in that September survey, a quarter of youth sports parents said that their child athletes' mental health had decreased slightly or greatly since the start of the pandemic. 22% said their child's emotional control had decreased. 30% said their child's social well-being had decreased. Now, since restrictions have been lifted, we asked parents whose children had returned to sports. Almost half of those parents said that their child's mental health has improved. A majority believe that their physical fitness, emotional control, and social well-being have increased by returning to sports. So parents observing their children saw a decrease in mental health when there was a limited access to sports during the pandemic, and then a recovery after the fact. But there could be some lasting impacts on access and participation. When we first surveyed parents in June 2020 at the start of the pandemic, 19% said that their child was not interested in returning to sports. By that September survey, a year and a half in, that number had climbed to 28%. So we saw that while kids who are returning to sports had improved mental health, there are a lot of kids who had given up on sports. And it's important that we make sure that those kids don't fall through the cracks and that we're able to give them access and a high quality experience that recognizes the possible trauma of having limited access to sports and the accumulated traumas throughout 2020 and the pandemic.
Yeah. Let's talk about access. because I know when we were getting ready for this webinar, this came up in our conversations a lot. And it's something that I'm sure we all felt and saw so keenly. Lance, are you able just to share a little bit of information around what you've witnessed through your community involvement socioeconomically? Let's talk about the impact in terms of access with youth sports.
Yeah, thanks, Eileen, for that question. It's been huge. After the pandemic, an even brighter light was shown on this issue. Public rec centers were locked up, courts were closed. In inner cities, rec centers were shut down. However, when you looked at more affluent communities, I don't want to say that a beat was not skipped, but the impact and the lack of access, the amount of restriction was far less. So if you had access to a private court, a country club, a private health club, you weren't impacted as greatly as kids from the inner city. It used to be, I was a tennis player as a kid, and so sports like tennis or golf, ice hockey, there used to be barriers from cost. Part of my job and what we're focused on at TeamSnap, working along with Martin and the Aspen Institute, is addressing the issue of affordability. When you look at the biggest barriers to sport, whether it's a sport like tennis or if it's a sport like basketball or baseball, with the prevalence of AAU and travel and private coaches and fields and nutritionists and college videos, the cost of just playing sports, even pre-pandemic, have increased exponentially. So it's not just those elite level sports, but it's with all sports. And even though kids might just be playing for fun and maybe not focused on winning, when you get to a certain level at the teenage years, yes, it's fun, but it costs to play. So once the pandemic hit, again, an even brighter light was shown on those disparities. And so we're really trying to increase access to sport by providing scholarships, by providing grants, by partnering with organizations like PCA and Aspen Institute to make sure that kids get a chance to play. So unfortunately, it is a real issue. I think that it's an issue that we're actively trying to address. And now that a light has been shown on it, we can make some strides to make some progress.
Yep. Along those lines, we have a question in from the audience that I think is quite interesting. And whoever posed this question, if I get this wrong, please just chat the moderator and let me know. Well, we're fine. Martin, it's a question for you, but it's exactly where I wanted to go with a discussion on gender. So, Martin, in your research, if 81% of of students is in it to have fun, why is there a discrepancy in terms of girls participating in sports?
That's an excellent question. As I'm pulling up the data here. I mean, there are a number of different barriers to access. Now, some of those could be practical barriers, like having too much schoolwork or having a work schedule outside of sports. Some of those are related to mental health, like not having friends to play with. But from those barriers, the ones where we saw the biggest gender discrepancies were the most common barrier overall was too much schoolwork, but there was a gender discrepancy there. 36% of boys, 47% of girls identified that as a barrier to participating in sports. Kids just not trying out, self-selecting themselves out of participation. 20% of boys said they didn't try out because they didn't think they were good enough. 28% of girls gave that response. Family responsibilities is a big one, and I think that really shows up in lower income levels as well. 16% of boys and 24% of girls said that they didn't participate in high school sports because of family responsibilities, but you also see that rate increasing with lower income levels. So there are, I think, a number of different barriers just relating to the different responsibilities that are placed on girls at the high school age, creating additional barriers for them to access sports.
That's fascinating. Thank you for that excellent question. Marty or Lance, is there anything that you would add here in terms of what you have witnessed on the gender disparity issue?
Absolutely. I mean, I could share just from personal experience as well, participating in sports and anything in life, when you see other people that look like you, you're more likely to go out and try that. And so I think there's a lack of female coaches and leaders. We need to be recruiting more people that reflect the community that they're serving. So I think providing more access to women in coaching roles and leadership roles will definitely help us recruit more kids to participate, more young girls to participate, and then also getting male allies and advocates to make sure that while these girls are participating, it's a safe space for them and they're having fun. So specific resources on how to coach girls specifically and make sure that they're feeling included, connected. They like to compete, but there's different spectrums of competing, right? So making it a safe space where you're constantly, we talk about filling the emotional tank at Positive Coaching Alliance and making sure that they know that they belong, that they're valued and they're worthy. So there's ways that we can make sure that the space is safe once girls are there so we can keep and retain girls in sports.
Yeah, and I just piggyback on that. I think especially I've got a teenage daughter, and so I hear friends talking sometimes. I think there's a stigma attached to some sports. Some sports aren't for girls, or girls are supposed to play some sports, or if they play a certain sport, they may be looked at one way. Not to conflate gender and race, but I got that a lot. I played a sport that wasn't for kids in my neighborhood. I was the only kid who had a tennis racket on the bus. And I think sometimes if a girl wants to play basketball or football or baseball, I mean, you name it, there's a social stigma that comes to it when they get to that teenage year. So to Marty's point, if they see more people, see other women, achieving, who they can look at and say, well, if she's doing it, I can do it too. I mean, you just look at what Venus and Serena have done for women's tennis, and you look at the professional game now. There's far more African American women competing at the professional level, and that, in large part, that's because young girls could look at Serena and Venus. So I think, as Marty said, women coaches and mentors and volunteers are really key in breaking down those stigmas that can be attached to girls participating in certain sports.
Yeah.
Thanks for mentioning that, Lance. I just wanted to add, I played softball and I didn't have a woman coach until college when I played at UCLA. So growing up, all my youth years, I was coached by males. So we definitely need to do better at recruiting female coaches at the youth level.
Yep. So this is a perfect segue where we're going to talk about some solutions. So we're starting to get some out on the table here. But of course, I first have to ask, now we know we have a softball player, a tennis player. Martin, what was your youth sport?
Golf, actually, which was a challenge because I was left-handed and it was hard to find secondhand left-handed golf clubs, but I made it work.
So nowadays, do they have those?
I would imagine so. I certainly have a left-handed set of clubs to go out and play around myself now.
Nice. And then as we start to talk about coaching, I have to ask another one. Have you ever coached a team? Marty, how about you?
Yes, absolutely.
Softball?
Yes. I coach at the youth level softball in the Natasha Watley League.
Nice. How about you, Lance?
Coached Philadelphia University, which is now Jefferson University in Philadelphia, which is D2 collegiate tennis.
Nice. Martin, how about you?
Can't say that I have. It's certainly an experience I'm looking forward to, but I'm also not yet a parent, which, as we know, is one of the big correlating points in the coach population. So I'm sure I'll get there.
Yeah, I did coach my daughter's volleyball team in the 3rd grade, and yes, was censured for pantomiming the other coach who was behaving in a ridiculous manner. But anyway, all right, so that would not be the solution I would suggest to effective coaching. So let's just dig in here on some more solutions. So Martin, what do you think in terms of how can we start to, again, even the playing field in terms of access socioeconomically? What are some of the recommendations that the Aspen Institute has in that arena?
I think the solution now is the same as when we published Project Play's Youth Sports Playbook 7 years ago, revitalizing those in-town leagues. Cost has always been the biggest barrier to access, as Lance said. And that's not just monetary cost. There's also the time cost for parents in providing transportation for their kids. which is a burden a lot of lower income parents can't shoulder. The good news is that lots of people are working on this problem. Every day I talk to people who are working to drive costs down and quality up. Everyone on this call is doing it. Lots of grant makers have shifted focus to lowering costs and increasing access during the pandemic, especially with an explicit focus on Black and Brown communities. As Lance mentioned, TeamSnap did a great job over the course of the pandemic in working to increase access. One of the most exciting solutions we've seen over the last few years has been linked to the growth of sports betting. Now, we're not advocates for sports betting at the Aspen Institute, but as it seems to be inevitable, the question becomes, how can we use those new sports linked revenues to give back to the community through sports? Right. And an interesting solution has been states setting aside a percentage of their sports betting revenues for community sports programs. New York State has it in their budget for this year. Half a dozen other states are debating it for their budgets next year. If you're interested in this topic, the Youth Sports Collaborative Network and the Play Sports Coalition are both doing great work in this. So yeah, the solution is bringing lower cost but higher quality opportunities closer to where kids live.
That's fascinating. I admit that my mind immediately went to corporate sponsors as the funding vehicle, but the betting angle is just so smart. When will New York State implement that, and when will we start to see some results?
It was actually implemented in their FY 2022 budget starting last fall. The first year, I remember off the top of my head, it's about $5 million in the first year, and then a certain percentage every year after that.
Mm-hmm. Well, hopefully that'll really blaze a path. Lance, how about some ideas from you in terms of diversity and inclusion? What are some solutions there to make sure that, we talked a little bit about access and some of the funding vehicles, which makes a ton of sense, but what can we do in terms of diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And first and foremost, it's not an issue that's going to address itself. And so I think intentional efforts, intentional thought has to be given to this. I used to run an organization called Arthur Ashe Youth Tennis and Education, and we created a program there called Future Stars. And we unapologetically focused on getting kids involved in tennis who were from underserved communities, particularly communities of color. Underserved kids come in all shades, but this goal, again, was unapologetically, our goal was to diversify the game of tennis and not just exposure. And I think oftentimes when we talk about underserved communities, we talk about exposure. In my mind, exposure without a pathway to excellence is doing those kids a disservice. Marty played at UCLA. The fact that she was at UCLA, thousands of other doors were opened up. She knows people from all over the world. She got her education. And that was because she got really good. And I think oftentimes we focus on kids from affluent communities getting good and exceeding. And we talk about underserved kids, is all about exposure. And again, exposure is great, but I think we have to be intentional about creating player development pathways so kids from underserved communities have the chance to progress and to play at the high school and the collegiate level, because as we all know, the more educational opportunities you have, the more opportunities that you have in life. So I think engaging local universities, local professional teams, local businesses, I think that each one of those entities has an obligation to the communities that they serve. And I think if each one of those partners with the SPEEDO, and that's a sport-based youth development organization, that creates a nice pathway within itself. You have the businesses who, as you said, could provide support. You have the colleges and universities who have coaches, they have facilities, and then you have the professional teams, which has the role models and the facilities and the budget. And then you have the local sport-based youth development organization who can tie in and feed each of them. So that's just one idea. Obviously, it's about funds and resources, but it's also about access to fields. It's about coaching. And if you can tie in the colleges and universities, the pro teams, and the local businesses, and then you have a SPEEDO who's oftentimes working with school districts, who's oftentimes working with parks and recs. They're feeding the kids, and then you have this whole system. You need somebody to tie it all together. That's where maybe an Aspen or a PCA comes in and all this working together. But I think it takes there's no magic wand. And if you talk about anybody who's successful at anything, there's a team, and there was a process that went in place. So I think connecting all of those different entities with a pathway to getting kids from point A to point Z. Now, some of them may drop off and go into a different direction, but I think, again, it's about creating a pathway, tying all those local resources together, and not just exposing the kids, but giving kids a pathway to get to the highest level that they can get to.
They can achieve. There's an interesting comment here from the audience that just popped in that I'll pose to y'all. Is the comment is volunteers are critical for community activities, and now we have the gig economy where folks are able to have a little more flexible working life and timelines. How would you think about engaging volunteers who may not be aware that there are opportunities to get involved with something like youth coaching?
I had this on my notes for calls for leadership, so that question got out in front of me, but I'll let one of my other colleagues take that question.
Yes, I think you should take it away. If you have it in front of you.
Well, what I was saying was I agree, and particularly from a diversity perspective, gender perspective, and what can you do? What I was thinking was if they asked, what can people do to get involved and help? And I think volunteerism is key. Oftentimes these SPEDOs, these local organizations don't have the funds to pay coaches. So if you have a level of expertise and you want to volunteer, you can go to, I think, Martin, you're working on this, a registry of all the sport-based youth development organizations. You can go to a website and you can pull up all the basketball organizations, all the football organizations, all the t-ball organizations. You can find out where they are, how they're structured. Obviously, if you have your child abuse clearance and your criminal clearance check, most SPEDOs will gladly welcome you. And even if you're not an expert in sport, a lot of these organizations are focusing on character education, on life skills. So even if you may not be qualified as a coach, there is a way that you can engage. So again, I don't think that registry is quite up and running yet. I'll let Martin speak to that, but just go on go on Google, go on your local sports-based youth development website and find out how to get engaged. And the more people that can engage, the more benefit the local sport-based community is going to receive from that. So it's a great question.
Yep.
Yeah, and I don't know, yes, we're working right now to bring partners to the table for that. It's an enormous project. That's one of the pipe dream projects for Project Play, but stay tuned for more as we bring partners together. I think getting the word out is key, and the easiest way to access parents is through schools. Most of our surveys of youth sports parents go through schools. It's the easiest way to access parents and then knock on to their kids. We recently produced a school sports playbook to be a sequel to our youth sports playbook. Some of the key calls in that are schools developing community partnerships with private sports clubs and organizers, creating new pathways for coach education, both within their staff and then within assistant coaches and parent volunteers. So I do think that there are certainly opportunities working through school-based sports to reach parents and inform them about volunteer opportunities, not only with the school, but also with other opportunities in the community.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about coaching here, because whether it's volunteer, parents, someone from a nonprofit, we know that a lot of the solutions are resting with coaches and effective coaching. And having led sales teams for my entire career, I know how important this is. And there's all sorts of research around informal and formal coaching and the right balance there. And I know that Marty, with the Positive Coaching Alliance, you've just done a ton of research here. But Lance, there's something that you mentioned a while ago when we were preparing for this conversation around the importance of looking at the entirety of the child's experience. And can you share some of the warning signs? So as people are starting to think about coaching and getting trained, what are some things that are super important where you can start to feel that maybe the kid isn't having fun. And that is 80% most likely reason that they're there to begin with. What should people really be thinking about?
Yeah, I think the word that you used was totality. And when you're a coach, you're not just coaching the sport. You really are engaging with that kid and giving them life skills. Coaches have really deep pockets. You may have a playbook in your mind or an idea of what you want to impart on that kid on that day, and the kid brings a different energy, and you just know they're not going to get it, and you have to be able to pivot really quickly. It's not just about X's and O's on the field. The coach is really often a friend, a mentor. In underserved communities, are also often a father figure or maybe a mother figure. You know, I can speak personally. Some of my best relationships with adults came from coaches. So I think coaches really have to be attuned to each kid, and there is no one size fits all. Every kid is different, and particularly with today's issues, you know, political, socioeconomic. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on in kids. So I think coaches not only have to be in tune to how the kid is performing sport technically wise, but they have to be in tune of, you know, are they always hungry? You know, are their clothes in good shape? You know, obviously I don't want to go to the extreme of are there bruises on his body, but you can't just be locked in and engaged on the sport. The way that where coaches are focused on the totality of the kid, coaches have to be aware of the totality of the circumstances. Do they have a ride home? You know, do they have money for the bus? You really have to be tuned in to all of those factors.
Yep. Yep. I mean, in many ways, it makes me think of, you know, folks I've known in the medical community, in that you don't just treat the thing that brought them to the hospital. You've got to think, where are they going after the hospital? Are there resources for that individual? Because if you heal them once and then they go back and there's not enough food, or there's, you know, it's a terrible gang environment, you're not fundamentally solving the problem.
Yeah, and it's tricky because oftentimes coaches get involved to the level where, you know, you're giving kids a ride home, or you give them $5, and the next week it's $10, and then next thing you know, the parents bringing you a bill. So it's a very fine line because you have to draw boundaries as a coach, but you also don't want to keep a kid at arm's length. So that's why coaching is just so important, because they have to walk such a fine line of being supportive without, again, crossing that line of being too involved in the kids and the family's life, which is really difficult when you're dealing with nonprofit, because there's real issues going on, and there's real issues in the home, and there's real financial problems. So, you know, when you get ingrained in the kid's life, or you get involved in the kid's life, and you start having success, and you see them grow, and you see their attitude changing, and you see their grades improving, and you see their self-esteem growing, it's hard to say, knowing that they're struggling, sorry, I can't help you.
Yep. So Marty, I'd love to shift to you in terms of, you know, what you've seen with the Positive Coaching Alliance in terms of benefits. And there's a comment that came in as well about just to reinforce here that coaches can come from anywhere. Doesn't have to be parents. Martin, here's your chance. Can be someone who is, you know, an expert at golf, left-handed golf, you know, whatever the case might be. But you know, just, you know, I know it's so important, Marty, your organization spends so much time really training coaches. So can you just talk about some of the best practices that the Alliance is suggesting?
Yes, absolutely. I think coach education is very important, just the things that Lance was mentioning. I mean, that's why we exist at Positive Coaching Alliance, because, you know, a caring coach, an effective coach can do wonders for a child. And I think some of the specific things that we talk about when we're creating that positive environment or helping coaches do that is based in that social emotional learning, right? Where coaches focus on, I mentioned before, filling the emotional tank. That's all about, you know, creating a connection with each kid. Just like Lance mentioned, not all kids are the same, right? So getting to know them individually, showing appreciation, listening for understanding. Those are all ways to fill that emotional tank with positive reinforcement. And when you create that connection first, then you'll get that commitment, right, from the kid and from the team. Another way, or another practical thing that we talk about is the ELM Tree of Mastery, which is an acronym for effort, learning, and mistake management, which is centered around Carol Dweck's growth mindset concept, focusing on the things that they can control and attributing their success to the effort behind it rather than, you know, innate talent or ability. And when you foster that growth mindset in youth, you know, it's a great way to help them with their resiliency and their belief in themselves and bouncing back after mistakes and failure. We do believe that sports is the safest place for kids to fail. So as a coach, you know, I want my players to not be afraid to fail and to get comfortable trying new things and, you know, not being good at it at first and getting better, right? So those are things that we teach. And last but not least, we teach that principle of honoring the game, respecting the rules, officials, opponents, teammates, and self. We think that coaches have to, you know, model the type of behavior that they want to see more of. And they should reward, you know, effort, even when it's unsuccessful. And they should provide as many opportunities for connections with their teammates where kids can connect with each other. And I think sports is a great way to help, you know, overcome some of the biases that we all have, because it offers that opportunity to build relationships and adapt a process of regulation, which helps us, you know, rewire the parts of our brain that control bias. So start exposing kids to, you know, new and positive experiences, so their ideas of what's safe and familiar will start to broaden, you know, and they won't just be, you know, with those or comfortable with those that look and sound just like them.
Yep. Question has come in from the audience in terms of, you know, Marty, would you be willing to share a few specifics? So, you know, perhaps just tactically, you're a coach, as you mentioned, you know, what are some times that you have exposed your team to a new experience or brought them together, or even just some phrases that you have used successfully?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, like I mentioned, connection is key. So creating like listening and sharing experiences or opportunities. So there's one thing that we used to do, like in the circle before practice as we're stretching, bet you didn't know. So everyone had to go around and say something about themselves that you might have not known. So it's helping people get to know each other, where everyone shares maybe even their favorite song or their favorite food or something like that. So we can get to know you as your individualistic self, your unique self, to feel more welcomed and belong on the team. We practice gratitude. We have gratitude routines and specific things that we can write down to get in that habit, which will help improve their mental health as well. I think, you know, physical activity is just so good for the brain and healing the mind and body. So specifically, pattern rhythmic repetition activities like dribbling or juggling or playing catch is even better because there's two people doing that, right? And that helps that regulation of our system and it creates that connection as well. So I think also in terms of helping kids bounce back quickly after mistakes and things like that, we use the 5-to-1 magic ratio for correction to praise. So as coaches, obviously we're going to have to correct, and that can definitely drain a kid's tank. But if you strive to, you know, 5 positive reinforcements to every correction over time, like over the course of a season, that can help them, you know, boost their self-esteem. I always talk about courage over confidence. Right? You might not feel the most confident trying this skill, but having the courage and the bravery to just get out there and try is what matters most. That's something I really focus on, especially with girls, courage over confidence.
Yeah, that's a great one. That is certainly a keeper. And just as a reminder, folks on the line, all of these materials, the data from Martin, a lot of what Marty's talking about here will be sent in a zip file after the fact. So you don't have to write everything down. There's a lot here. Let's shift a little bit to some of the long-term solutions. There's another question from the audience that's quite intriguing around female coaches. So recognizing there is this gender disparity, what is the long-term solution to get more women coaching, not just female sports, but male sports? So that was a question posed by one of our listeners. Jump ball.
I'll just make a quick point. I think we're already starting to see some growth. I think the NFL had their first woman coach. I think the NBA had their first assistant coach. I think there was a referee in one of the professional leagues. So there are strides being taken. I know it's not close to enough, but at least we can point to few, or a young girl can point, or even a young boy. I think it's good for, we always talk about what's good for young girls to see women coaches, but I also think it's good for young boys to see that they're women coaches, because then that changes the mindset and the stigma that's out there that girls can't do certain things, boys shouldn't do certain things. So I know it's not a solution, but I will point out that I think that there are strides being taken, because the conversation that we're having, people weren't having 10, 15, 20 years ago. So I think a big step is panels like these. And it's like the diversity issue. It's not something that's going to happen on its own. And intentional action starts with intentional conversation. So I think that's really the first step.
Yeah, we're doing our part to be intentional with this as well when it comes to recruiting girls and supporting girls in sports. I think also, you know, at the youth level, we can do more co-ed programs, right, where girls are participating with boys at the same time. And I think that does a lot for raising young men to respect girls as well, and focusing on, you know, gender equity models and making sure that once, you know, we bring more women in, and we're also supporting them and providing, you know, specific ways that they can make sure that all girls know that they belong, and we can start breaking a lot of those stigmas. We're doing a lot of research on this now, and targeting new recruiting tools, working with different organizations. One of our recruiting organizations we work with is Field Level. So I think it definitely depends on creating those partnerships with people out there that are actually doing this work, so you don't feel like you have to do it all alone. So finding where they are now, recruiting from there, and then also making sure that we're doing the work to keep them engaged when they're there.
Yeah, I think that's important. Martin, in some of the work that I read about, I noticed your call for leadership. So, you know, can you share with us a little bit about what does that mean? Number one, who are you calling, or whom are you calling? And what are you calling about? What is that call for leadership? And maybe there's something in here around the gender issue as well.
Sure. The call for leadership is a standard element from all of our playbooks, all of our state of play reports. These are calls for leaders in the 8 sectors that intersect with the lives of kids. Tech and media, public health, parents, education, business and industry. We have the list on our website at aspenprojectplay.org/esports/playbook. The most recent call for leadership from the state of play report in 2021 highlighted 4 elements. And the first element, which I think I really hope is a great long-term solution, now, is that we'll start to hear the conversation shift to the rights that children have in sports, both to and in sports, as an extension of their innate human rights. We produced a Children's Bill of Rights in Sports last year, inspired primarily by a similar document in Norway, but informed by leaders from across the world of sports. When you shift your thinking about youth sports to a rights-based approach, the system looks entirely different. All kids have a right to play sports. So why is the system designed to be exclusive, to winnow kids out based on performance? All kids have a right to play for a qualified program leader. So why is the system so reliant on informal labor? All kids have the right to play at a developmentally appropriate level. So why is the system so focused on winning, right? When you think about it in a different way, all of these questions arise. And there's been so much energy around this concept. We've had 100 different organizations endorse it. Our friends over at TeamSnap have been key supporters. You may have heard Under Armour's recent commercials, the tagline, "We all have the right to experience the gift of the game." I love that framing because it's not just the right to participate, it's the right to benefit. And they were an early endorser of that Bill of Rights. Beyond that, our partners at Athletes for Hope have been fielding endorsements from individual athletes, including some recently at the Senior Bowl from, off the top of my head, Malik Willis, Kenny Pickett, Desmond Ridder, other future NFL stars. So we're really excited to see how this starts to shift the conversation, and that now this rights-based concept can grow access in the long term.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's super, super important. You mentioned something in there around developmentally appropriate interactions and sports. We have a question here from the audience that poses the question of what can be done long-term about mitigating the drop-off that occurs as students age. So what are some long-term solutions? And still we can certainly circle back, excuse me, to some short-term solutions about that drop-off.
I'll field that one first, and then the other panelists are welcome to join in. It's a good point and a good question. There is a drop-off that happens as kids go from the out of school-based club and travel system into the school-based system. Some kids make the jump, some kids don't. Some kids never make the jump and go on into elite travel clubs, but that's a very small percentage. So I think one of the solutions is through that school-based system, and it's one of the elements of our school sports playbook, introducing other forms of play and physical activity through schools. Now, in college, there are the intercollegiate athletic teams, the athletic department, but there are also a huge variety of club and intramural sports that just take place on campus. There's no need to travel, there's not a scholarship, it's just playing for the joy of playing. That's certainly a model that high schools could introduce. There's not really much reason that they couldn't, especially since it's going to be lower cost since there's not as much travel involved. So there's certainly those opportunities, creating more avenues into recreational play in high schools that can then tap into recreational play at college and recreational play at adult levels.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Others want to weigh in on that question, mitigating drop-off?
I mean, I think Martin did a great job there. I would just add, making sure that the experience is fun. It's a place that they want to be in, right? That they're coming back and enjoying. So that's one thing that we're focusing on when we're training coaches on how they're showing up in this space for kids, how they're creating this experience where, yeah, we can challenge them, but also provide them the tools that they need to meet those expectations and be successful. So they want to see improvement while they're participating. So focusing on, rewarding effort, filling that emotional tank, incentives, and, rewarding the type of behavior that you want to see more of. I think those are really key to making sure that kids are coming back and participating every year when they have a fun experience.
Yep, very true. So magic wand, if you were to look out in 3 to 5 years and say, I want this change to have occurred. Let's do an around the room here. What would be the change that you would say would be the most impactful in terms of evening the playing field?
This is a magic wand.
Magic
If it's a magic wand, for me, I would say no kid would be turned away from a sport based on where he's from, how much money he or his family has. If a kid wants to engage in a sport, no matter what that sport is, cost will not be a reason why he does not play, why he or she does not play.
Mm-hmm. So Lance, you're really, really going to the funding mechanisms.
Yes,
Yeah.
I am. And when you look at the amount of money that's at the top of the level of every sport, I think that there's like Martin just said, 1% of the gambling revenue could fund all of New York Public Schools sports program. So I mean, I think if the right people take a hard look at the revenue from the NCAA tournament, the revenue from the US Open, the revenue from the World Cup, there's a lot of dollars in professional sports, and youth sports is leading up to professional. So it's a vested interest in the top of the pyramid to invest in the bottom of the pyramid. I don't know exactly why that's not happening across the board. I think it's happening in different pockets. Some of the governing bodies, you look at US Soccer, you look at the United States Tennis Association, you look at Babe Ruth baseball. I mean, some of these governing bodies and state associations are creating programs and giving scholarships and creating pathways for kids, particularly from underserved communities. But it just doesn't seem to be an ingrained part of sport across the board. And I think increasing access, looking at gender issues, looking at socioeconomic issues, if you really want to see a change, just like far too many things in life, it comes down to dollars. It comes down to cost. So
Yep.
yes, that's where I would go.
Yeah. And I think it's an interesting point that you raise in that you have the leagues and then you have the states and the local communities where the money has to flow. And I think that probably is a very valid challenge, is that if you're going to make sure that the playground does not have a padlock on it and that the playing field is functioning, that has to eventually flow through government entities. And I think that's probably something that is quite challenging. So, okay, magic wand, Marty or Martin, who's next?
Okay.
Ready.
I think closing that play equity gap is so important. So not to repeat what Lance said, I would add SEL training would be mandatory for all coaches. I think when you provide education for coaches that's based in social and emotional learning, coaches can understand why a young person behaves the way that they do. Coaches can make better decisions, more allowances, have more empathy, or be prepared with more tools to deal with that behavior. So I think that's something that I would add in that future long-term picture, in addition to what Lance mentioned.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying there too is that these are trainable behaviors, like that can be achieved, but people have to be open to becoming better coaches. So certainly there is an openness there. Martin, over to you. Probably the last word here. What's your magic wand? You've got a lot of data that you've seen. What's it going to take?
First, with a magic wand, I can't let a conversation on mental health and inclusion in youth sports go by without saying I would wish that trans kids have the opportunity to play sports in environments where they're comfortable. Well, that's a real magic wand. We'll see where we are in 3 to 5 years. And actually, I'll shift that to 4 to 6 years, because 4 years from now is the FIFA Men's World Cup in the United States, and 6 years from now is the Summer Olympics in Los Angeles. And it's probably too late to be developing the athletes we'll be playing in those games in the youth levels. There could very well be some fantastic high school athletes, but they already know that they're going to be a fantastic high school athlete that's likely to participate in those events. It is not too late to develop the next generation of fans and consumers for those events and for those sports. So there are real opportunities for FIFA, US soccer, MLS, everybody in the soccer space, and then through the Olympics, every other national governing body, to be developing plans for outreach to young people and creating increased access. So many of the NGBs are focused on developing the high-level athletes because they want to win medals. Medals attract sponsors. But we can't forget that by creating a system of access, we can tell that it helps sponsors tell a great story related to those events, but it also develops the next generation of fans and athletes and parents of future athletes. It's a huge opportunity that we can't let go to waste.
Yeah. And so it's interesting to me, Martin, that you, in a different way, went at the funding mechanism, less from it's about transfer, quote, of wealth to the leagues or to teams, but you're talking about if you can get more consumer engagement, more of the money will flow, and that eventually should come back to raising the level of access for all. Well, very important conversation. I can't thank y'all enough. Audience participants, 2 quick things. Number 1, there's going to be a survey. It's going to pop right up. Please take a moment. Let us know what you thought. We hope it was a great experience for everyone. And again, number 2, be on the lookout, please, for an email with all of these great resources that Martin, Lance, and Marty shared with us. And a special thank you to TeamSnap for sponsoring this outstanding conversation. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Eileen.